Margaret Sanger, a woman before her time. Throughout history, Americans have spent a lot of time and energy arguing about birth control, abortion, and Planned Parenthood. Whether it's a political, religious, or financial debate, many Americans find birth control and preventative contraceptives a hot topic conversation. While the fight against Planned Parenthood and contraceptives might continue for many years, not only in our households, schools, and court systems, it's important to remember that the history and creation of both birth control and Planned Parenthood was a heroic battle fought by a woman before her time. Margaret Sanger was an early feminist and women's rights activist who coined the term birth control and strived towards its legalization. Sanger, born as Margaret Higgins, was welcomed to this world September 14, 1879. Margaret was one of 11 children born into a working-class Irish family. Anne Higgins, Margaret's mother, had birthed many children and had several miscarriages. Unfortunately, Margaret's mother passed away at the young age of 40, and Sanger believed her poor health was a direct result of many pregnancies. Growing up, Sanger and her siblings lived a more impoverished life as Michael Higgins, Margaret's father, was a struggling alcoholic. In search of a better life, Sanger left for college in her late teens. Sanger attended Claveret College and Hudson River Institute in 1896, and later went on to study nursing at White Plains Hospital in 1900. Later, in 1902, Margaret married William Sanger, an architect, and later the two welcomed 3 children. In 1910, William and Margaret moved to New York City and settled down in Greenwich Village, a Manhattan neighborhood. At this time, the area was a bohemian enclave known for radical politics and progressive ideas and movements. The couple became immersed in a liberal world of reforms. The couple socialized with writer Upton Sinclair and anarchist Emma Goldman. While in New York City, Sanger joined the Women's Committee of the New York Socialist Party and the Liberal Club. Sanger and her husband, both supporters of the Industrial Workers of the World Union, participated in local strikes and protests. Margaret Sanger was known as a pioneer in sexual education. In 1912, Sanger began her campaign to educate and inform women about sex in a newspaper column known as What Every Girl Should Know. During this time, Sanger was also a nurse on the Lower East Side, which, at the time, was a predominantly poor immigrant neighborhood. Through her nursing career, Sanger treated a plethora of women who had undergone back-alley abortions or attempted to terminate their own pregnancies. Margaret was deeply perturbed by the suffering of these women and objected to the unnecessary suffering women were facing when they were confronted with an unwanted pregnancy. This is when Sanger first starts to dream of a magic pill that could be used to control pregnancy. 2 years later, in 1914, Sanger started her own feminist publication called The Woman Rebel. This publication promoted women's rights to have birth control, safe reproductive health care, and, overall, rights to their own bodies. However, Sanger found herself in some trouble because during that time it was illegal to send out information on contraceptives through the mail. The Comstock Act of 1873 prohibited the trade and circulation of obscene and immoral materials. The act included publications, devices, and medications related to contraception and abortion and its definitions of obscene materials. The act made mailing and importing anything related to these topics punishable as a crime. However, like the woman rebel Sanger was, to avoid a possible 5-year sentence, Sanger fled to England. While in England, Margaret worked in the women's movement and researched other forms of birth control, including diaphragms, which she later smuggled into the United States once returning. During this time, William and Margaret did separate and later divorced. As someone that embraced the idea of free love, Sanger found herself immersed in several affairs throughout the rest of her life. Not only was Margaret Sanger a pioneer for sexual education, but she was also an advocate for contraception. In October of 1915, after her charges had been dropped, Margaret Sanger returned to the United States. Once returning, Sanger began touring the country to promote her magic pill, or, as coined by Sanger herself, birth control. In 1916, she then opened her first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. Her and her staff at the time were all arrested during a raid 9 days after opening. Sanger and her sister spent 30 days in jail for breaking the Comstock law again. Later appealing her conviction, Sanger was able to score a victory for the birth control and women's rights movement. Although the court would not overturn the earlier verdict, the court did make an exception in the existing law that would now allow doctors to prescribe contraception to their female patients for medical reasons. This is also around the same time Margaret also published her first issue of the Birth Control Review. Several years later, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. The American Birth Control League was the beginning foundations of what is known today as Planned Parenthood Federation of America. In 1923, Margaret then opened the first legal birth control clinic in the United States. After several years of working for her league and clinic, Sanger wanted to advance her cause legally, and in 1929, Sanger created the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control. The committee sought to make it legal for doctors to freely distribute birth control devices and related material to be imported into the country. Sanger eventually stepped out of the spotlight for a time, choosing to settle down in Tucson, Arizona. Her retirement, however, did not last too long. She worked on the birth control issue in other countries in Europe and Asia, and she established the International Planned Parenthood Federation in 1952. Still seeking a magic pill, Sanger recruited Gregory Pincus, a human reproduction expert, to work on the problem in the early 1950s. She found the necessary financial support for the project from Catherine McCormick, the international harvester heiress. This research project would yield the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, which was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. Sanger lived to see another important reproductive rights milestone in 1965, when the Supreme Court made birth control legal for married couples in its decision on Griswold v. Connecticut. She died a year later on September 6, 1966, in a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona. Across the nation, there are numerous women's health clinics that carry the Sanger name, in remembrance of her efforts to advance women's rights and the birth control movement. Today, the country's relationship with birth control, one in which we are just as likely to see a television commercial for much like we would for a local car dealership, has dramatically improved. No longer a taboo topic hiding in the shadows, birth control is a part of the public conversation and widely accessible to women of different socioeconomic backgrounds. In 1916, Sanger and many other women and men along her side began a century-long process. Their actions ignited a series of changes in how the public would regard contraceptives and how the law would increasingly allow for birth control services. 100 years later, and we have Margaret Sanger and her friends along the way to thank for the advancement of our country's relationship with birth control services.